of all, a huge round of applause for our guest today, Professor Ashar Susar. We also have Ambassador Gautam Bambawale, who would be chairing the session today, and Mr. Sujit Haridas, who represents Ananta Aspen Center. What I'm going to do is very quickly get done with what I have to say so that we get to hear both Ambassador Bambawale and Professor Susar. Very brief introduction, if I might attempt. Professor Ashar Susar is Professor Emeritus of Middle Eastern History at Tel Aviv University. He was Director of the Moshe Dayan Center for Middle Eastern Studies at TAU for 12 years and taught for over 35 years in TAU's Department of Middle Eastern History. He has been a Fulbright Fellow, a visiting faculty at various universities in the US and other parts of the world. You might have read some of the books that he has written. His most recent book is The Emergence of Modern Middle East. He also wrote Israel, Jordan, and Palestine, the two-state imperative. Then Jordan, case study of a pivotal state. The other book is a political biography of Jordan's Prime Minister Al-Tal. The rise of Hamas in Palestinian and crisis of secularism in Arab world. Professor Susar also conducts online course on the emergence of modern Middle East, and it's been taken by more than 95,000 students. Lucky us that we are not online, that we get to do this face-to-face interaction today. So thank you so much for doing that. I must while I introduce Ambassador Bambawale and Mr. Sujit Haridas, I must mention that this program has been brought together by PIC, Ananta Aspen Center, CII, and Tel Aviv University. I thank, even before we begin program, Ms. Kiran Pasricha from the Ananta Aspen Center, who proactively came forward to organize this program together. I also thank Professor Gary for putting all of this together, so thank you so much, and many, many others who kind of came together to make this happen. Ambassador Gautam Bambawale, very few of you might need introduction, but it's always pride and privilege to talk about Ambassador Bambawale, who was our ambassador in Bhutan. Some of you know him as the ambassador in Pakistan, and his recent stint in China as Indian ambassador in China. He is also known among many of us as the architect of the Wuhan summit that took us all the way from Doklam to Wuhan. And much is talked about the positive aspects of that and how it's leading to the next summit already. We're very, very proud of the fact that Ambassador Bambawale is a member of Pune International Center, and he's taking forward some of the initiatives of PIC. He also teaches at Symbiosis University on international relations here. We're thankful to you, sir, that you kindly agreed to chair the session today. Thank you so much. We also have on the dais Mr. Sujit Haridas, who is representing the Ananta Aspen Center. He joined Ananta Aspen Center as ED in June 18. Mr. Haridas joined the Ananta Aspen Center with 2 decades of experience in policy advocacy and industrial promotional activities with CII. He worked there as Deputy DG and was responsible for many, many domains as well as various geographical areas. He is a known face among many industrialists around here. I'm thankful to all of them for being here today. It's mentioned that few months ago rather, I went to Israel as part of the Discover Israel program on invitation of Government of Israel. It's wonderful visiting each of those universities. I think there are 9 of those, if I'm not wrong. We visited each one of those, and of course the biggest one, the Tel Aviv University. We went around there to see some wonderful work that happens right from philosophy to history to all the way to the startups, and the billions of dollars that the startups made while doing the work that they did there. But that's for another occasion to talk about Tel Aviv University and Israel. We are here to hear the professor on Middle East of the 21st century, Before that, may I request the chairperson of the program today, Ambassador Gautam Bambawale, to please give his opening remarks. So,
thank you very much, Prashant. You know, diplomacy is and international relations is a serious business. But let me start with a few amusing anecdotes, which I hope will lighten up the atmosphere for Professor Sasser's talk later. Um, I had a senior colleague in the Indian Foreign Service. He was a Sikh gentleman, a Sardarji, and he was selected by the then government of India to be India's first Sikh ambassador to Israel. And a number of people asked him, Ambassador, have you been chosen because you're a minority person in India? And he said, no, I have not been chosen because I'm a minority. I've been chosen for my good looks. That was Ambassador Raminder Singh Jassal, who is unfortunately no longer with us. And he used to narrate to me another of his typical remarks which he used to make in Israel, by Professor Asher Sasser from Tel Aviv University, Professor Emeritus there, is about the Middle East of the 21st century, which is the Middle East of today and tomorrow. And I believe that his hypothesis is that increasingly in the Middle East, it is not the Arab nations, not the Arab countries which are important, it's the non-Arab countries like Israel, Iran, and Turkey which are playing the defining role, the defining role play is being done by these countries. India herself, of course, has strengthened its relations with all countries across the Middle East. We have managed to de-link relations with Israel from relations with the Arab countries. We have strengthened in the recent past our relations with Israel with the visits of the two prime ministers to each other's country, of Prime Minister Modi to Israel and of Prime Minister Netanyahu to India. But at the same time, we have also strengthened our relations with all the Arab countries, particularly the UAE and Saudi Arabia. We have managed to do this by de-linking the two, and I hope that we are able to move forward in this manner and strengthen our ties with all these countries. Iran, as all of you have been reading in the newspapers, is becoming a particularly troubling issue for India because of the pressure that we are facing from the United States, particularly in stopping imports of petroleum and oil from Iran. How India will face such issues in the coming days, how we will be able to overcome the lack of imports of petroleum from Iran is something that we will have to decide as we move ahead. But I do not want to stand between you and Professor Asher Sasser. He's going to be talking to us about the Middle East of the 21st century. I will hand over the microphone and the floor to him immediately and look forward to your interaction with him at the end of his talk. Thank you very much, and a loud round of applause for our chief guest, our main speaker, Professor Asher Sasser.
Good evening, and I thank Prashant and the ambassador for their very kind remarks of introduction. I knew Ambassador Raminder in Israel. I used to meet him often. We would meet for lunch, have dinner at his home. I knew him very well. He is one of the greatest diplomats who served in Israel that I have ever met. In terms of two things, his general knowledge, his understanding of the Jewish problem, as you could call it. He served in Europe before he served in Israel. And his brilliance in analyzing the regional situation. It was a privilege and a pleasure to have known him. And I must say, I'm awfully sorry to know that he's not with us any longer. The ambassador mentioned that my talk is about the Middle East today and tomorrow. Well, I'll start with a story of this fellow who visits Israel. And his Israeli friend asked him, what have you come to do here? When did you arrive? He said, I came yesterday. And when are you leaving? I'm leaving tomorrow. And what have you come to do here? He says, I've come to write a book. And the friend says, well, what is the book about? He says, it's about Israel yesterday, today, and tomorrow. But speaking about the Middle East of the 21st century, the first thing I would say is to repeat what the ambassador said before. The Middle East of the 21st century is not the Arab world as it used to be. For much of the 20th century, for 100 years, if not more, the term Middle East and the term Arab world were coterminous. If you would ask someone what the Middle East was, it would be the Arab world. And what is the Arab world? It's the Middle East. But this is, for more than a generation, not the case. The Arab countries have declined in politically, economically, in terms of their internal stability, in their relative power in the region. Today, there is not a single Arab state that you could call a power that determines the pace of events in the Middle East. And I compare this to the 1950s and the 1960s, where the key figure in the Arab world was Abdel Nasser. There was no question. And Abdel Nasser was the key mover and shaker, the president of Egypt. And Abdel Nasser was up there on the stage of international politics with great international figures like Nehru and Tito as the leaders of the non-aligned movement. Who is the Abdel Nasser of the Arab world today? There is none. So we have approached an era which I call the crisis of the Arabs. And what are the causes of the crisis of the Arabs? Why have the Arabs declined in their regional importance, in their international clout? There are studies that have been conducted for about 20 years by the United Nations that are called the Arab Human Development Reports. The Arab Human Development Reports, I want to emphasize, are written by people who work for the UN, but these people who write about the Arab countries for the UN are for the most part Arab scholars also. That is not Europeans or Americans writing about the Arabs. That is maybe people who may have some anti-Arab or anti-Islamic bias, overcritical of the Arab countries. No, these are Arab professionals, Arab scientists and scholars and economists and social scientists, etc., writing about the Arab world. And what they write about the Arab world, and has been consistently so, is rather pessimistic. And if you read these Arab Human Development Reports, going back over the last 15, 18 years, you will readily understand what the Arab Spring was and where it came from. The Arab Spring was not this outburst of democratic sensitivities. It was an expression of despondency, the lack of hope, the pessimistic view of the future of an entire generation of young Arab people who see no future for themselves. There is this generation who were those who rose up in rebellion in recent years, those young people from the age of 18 to 30, who an American historian of the Middle East has called the waithood generation. After childhood comes boyhood. And after boyhood, when you reach 18, you enter the age of waithood, waiting. Waiting for a decent education, waiting for a decent job, none of which is about to happen. And it is very well known to this age group of 18 to 30 that there is very little to wait for in the foreseeable future. So how have we arrived at this point? What do the Arab Human Development Reports say that can give us some indication of how we got there? They speak of 3 deficits that the Arab countries suffer from. A deficit in political freedom, a deficit in first world education systems, and a deficit in gender equality. Now, these 3 deficits combine to create the socio-economic reality that we see. Let's take the first 2. The lack of political freedom and the lack of first world education systems. In the globalized world of today, the globalized economies of today, based on technology and on innovation, the lack of political freedom, the lack of first world education systems creates the lack of innovation, the lack of creativity. Economies that lack this drive of innovation in technology that is the backbone of modern economies. None of the Arab states possess an economy of that nature. They lag way behind. But perhaps worst of all of these 3 factors is the lack of gender equality. Now, people talk about gender equality all the time. It's very politically correct to talk about gender equality. But I don't raise the issue of gender equality, and nor did the people who conducted the Arab Human Development Reports do so for reasons of political correctness, but due to the economic impact of gender inequality. In the Arab countries, there is a traditional objection to women working outside the home. There are relatively low levels of female participation in the workforce in the Arab countries. So you have a situation where, for starters, nearly half the population doesn't work. That cannot allow for the production of a well-balanced economy. Women who are marginalized from the education system, and women who have lower levels of education than men, due to this lack of gender equality, also tend to have large families. The less educated women are, the larger families they tend to have. This is not a Middle Eastern phenomenon, this is universal. Women with higher levels of education tend to have smaller families. So if you take the combination of these 2, low participation in the labor force and high population growth, you don't have to be an economist to recognize that this is a recipe for disaster. Poorly performing economies with rapidly growing populations. I'm not talking about a prediction. This is not a prediction about the future. This is the present. We are in the disaster. And the Arab Spring was very much an outburst of this disaster. The Arab countries form a region which cannot sustain its population. The population of the Arab countries has grown from the year 2000, when it was 280 million, to today, when it is 420 million. A growth of 100 million just in the last 10 years. In the 2020s, The Arab countries will approach 460 million. Who will provide for these people? Who will provide the jobs for these people? Where will the money come to sustain these people? Who will provide the water for these people? By 2025, Egypt is destined to suffer from a serious water shortage if something dramatic is not done between now and then. The Middle East, as a result, has become a region beset by civil wars, refugees, and emigration. Emigration out of realization that the region cannot sustain its population and they must emigrate. Even if the civil war comes to a complete standstill in the next few months, people from Syria will still emigrate, as they will from other countries, for lack of any better choice. The Arab countries have just over 5% of the world's population, but 37% of the world's refugees. The Arab states, in the years between 2010 and 2015, lost more than $600 billion income due to domestic conflicts. That is irreparable. Syria has been destroyed by civil war. How many hundreds of billions of dollars will be required to rebuild Syria? Who has that kind of money? Oil used to be a means to overcome some of these shortages. But oil wealth is not what it was. And oil prices are not what they used to be either. So countries that are relatively wealthy, like Saudi Arabia, don't have the wherewithal to cover for these losses. A country like Jordan, for example, suffering from the influx of somewhere around 1 million refugees from Syria. Jordan always dependent on foreign aid. What will happen to Jordan if Saudi Arabia cannot cover the bill in the next 10 or 15 years? Who will? There is not one single Arab power that we can argue is today a regional power. Not Egypt, not Syria, not Iraq, each of which is suffering from its own domestic crisis of one sort or another. And people would often say, yes, but what about Saudi Arabia? To which I would say, well, what about Saudi Arabia? There is nothing much that Saudi Arabia can really do to change the regional reality. Saudi Arabia is deeply anxious by the growing regional clout of Iran. But Saudi Arabia cannot face Iran on its own. Saudi Arabia looks to Israel for support. So one may ask, if the Arab states have not been so successful in the process of modernization, why were the non-Arab states, like Turkey and Iran, more successful? And I think the reason is to be found in the fact that neither Turkey nor Iran are recent imperial creations, as were many of the Arab states in the drawing of the lines in the aftermath of the First World War. Turkey has been there for centuries, was the Ottoman Empire. Iran has been there for more than 2,000 years. There is a Turkish nation that speaks the Turkish language, and the Iranians who speak Persian. They have a linguistic identity, a cultural identity that goes back for centuries. They were not colonial states. They were never colonized. They have been independent powers for centuries. They are long-standing players in the game of nations. And they enjoy what one could call a very high level of stateness, which is not necessarily the case of most of the Arab states, many of them. As an example of the current Arab weakness, I come back to the question of Syria. The civil war in Syria is grinding to an end. There are a number of powers that are negotiating the stabilization and the reconstruction of Syria. And who are they? Russia, Turkey, and Iran. The Arabs are not even invited to the table. Nobody even talks to them. They have become irrelevant to the determination of a key Arab state like Syria, the fate of which is now determined by Russians, Turks, and Iranians. And this is very different from the era of Abdel Nasser. Abdel Nasser, his greatness in the 1950s, when Syria seemed to be falling apart in the late 1950s, Abdel Nasser collected Syria into his lap and created the United Arab Republic by uniting Syria with Egypt. Egypt saved Syria from disintegration at the request of the Syrians themselves. That is an example of the huge discrepancy that has emerged between the 1950s, the era of Arabism, and the Middle East of the 21st century. Political Arabism, Arab nationalism, that great force that was represented more effectively by Abdel Nasser than by anybody else. Arab nationalism was this messianic vision composed of Arab unity, Arab socialism, and an alliance in the Cold War with the Soviet Union. This was the magic formula for success. Unity, Arab socialism, and the Soviet Union would provide the Arabs with the power and the prestige and the prosperity that they deserved as a great international player. But it didn't produce any of these. And Arab nationalism ended up as a dismal failure, represented most decisively and humiliatingly in the defeat of the Arabs by Israel in 1967, where this whole idea that Abdel Nasser represented was crushed in 6 days of war. The defeat was not just a defeat in the battlefield. It was a defeat in the world of ideas. Now the Islamists could argue, we told you so. This idea of accepting Western-style ideas, Western-style secularism, is wrong from the outset and is bound to end in failure. After all, this idea of Arab nationalism is a Western idea. The idea that people speak a certain language or a nation is a European idea. Germans speak German and have a country called Germany. And France is a country of Frenchmen who speak French. And all of Europe is made up of countries of such a nature, just about. Arab nationalism was this new secular idea influenced by Europe. The people in the Middle East never defined themselves by the language they spoke. The peoples of the Middle East, for centuries upon centuries, defined themselves by their religion. You were either a Muslim or something else. And if you were a Christian, what kind of Christian? There are all sorts of different denominations. The Copts and the Orthodox and the Maronites And if Muslims, then Sunnis and Shiis. The idea that all the people who speak Arabic are a nation is this Western style, European emulation invention. So the failure of Arabism is also the failure of this effort to secularize Arab society. It's the failure of the secularization process. And the failure has been filled, the void has been filled by political Islam. Where the Islamists can say, as they do, Islam is the solution, not this westernizing, copying of the Europeans. We must go back to who we really are. And in Arabic they say, Al-Islam huwa al-khal. Islam is the solution. But if Islam is the solution, whose Islam? Sunnah or Shia? There are different versions of this vision of political Islam. The Sunni version speaks about the creating of just societies that are based on the implementation of religious law, the Sharia. A just society is a society governed by the Sharia. A society which is not governed by the Sharia is an unjust society. There was a Muslim thinker in India, Abu Ala al-Maududi, who had great influence in the Arab world also, who spoke about a non-Muslim society, a society not governed by Islamic law, as a society of Jahiliyyah. Jahiliyyah in the Muslim concept of history is that period of ignorance and barbarism that preceded the advent of Islam and the revelation of the Prophet. So the Sunni doctrine is about the implementation of the law. But in the Sunni world, there is no papacy, there is no pope, there is no central religious authority who will determine exactly how one is supposed to implement the Sharia. And there are dozens, hundreds of political movements, militias, political parties that have interpretations of their own. And the Sunni world, therefore, is deeply divided within itself about how to go about this implementation of the Sharia. If you look at the civil war in Syria, there were dozens of Islamic militias fighting against the regime that part of the time fought together and part of the time fought with each other. At times it looked like the Hobbesian world of the war of all against all. So in this world of political Islam, you have a deeply divided Arab society. It is the weakening of the Arab states, the reassertion of sectarianism, of the difference between Muslims and Muslims, and of the difference between Muslims and Christians. It's not the papering over of sectarianism that Arabism provided. We are all Arabs, whether we are Christians or Muslims. On the contrary, it exacerbates division within the Sunni community, within the Arab states, the reassertion of sectarianism. If you look at Iran, the Shiite example, the doctrine is different. The Shiite doctrine does not speak so centrally of the law. Although, of course, for the Shia, the Sharia is also important. But the centerpiece of Shiite radicalism is not the implementation of the Sharia, but the nature of the ruler It must be the rule of the jurisprudent. The Ayatollah must rule. That is what creates a just society. A society ruled by the men of religion. And here, there is much more unity. You have Iran, a state run by the Ayatollahs. Shi'is throughout the region look to Iran as an authority, follow the political and religious guidance of Iran. Not all Shi'is are at one with this ideology, but most Shi'is are. Shi'is in Lebanon look to Tehran. Shi'is in Yemen look to Tehran. Shi'is in Iraq look to Tehran. So what is so divisive in the Sunni world is very unifying in the Shiite example. That is about doctrine and dogma. But what about geopolitics? And here one has to go back to the US invasion of Iraq in 2003. Saddam Hussein was an evil dictator. And maybe it was a good thing to overthrow him. But the American plan never worked, and I don't think could ever have worked. And I don't think the Americans really knew exactly what it was that they were doing. Removing Saddam is not going to usher in a democracy. Removing Saddam will usher in a civil war between the Sunnis and the Shiites of Iraq, which is exactly what happened. The Shiites of Iraq are the majority, always were the majority in Iraq. But they were the majority, but the downtrodden underclass, ruled for centuries, even before the creation of the state of Iraq, under the Ottomans. And then when the British created Iraq, it was always the Sunnis who were the rulers of Iraq. The Ba'ath Party was the political machinery whereby the Sunnis ruled over Iraq and ruled over the Shiite majority. By removing Saddam, by removing the Ba'ath, you disempower the Sunnis and you empower the Shiites. So Iraq is now a Shiite-dominated state, exactly like the co-religionists across the border in Tehran, thereby converting Iraq into an Iranian sphere of influence. Whereas prior to this intervention by the US, Saddam's Iraq may have been an evil place, but it was the gatekeeper to the Arab East. It kept Iran out. It prevented Iran from stretching its influence into the core of the Arab East. The Arab East is what the Arabs call the Mashriq, as opposed to the Maghreb, which is the West, North Africa. So Iraq was converted into a sphere of influence for Iran. So if you add the advantage of dogma, you come to the geopolitical revolution, one may say, where Iran has the capacity to stretch its influence from Tehran to Iraq, from there to their allies in Syria, and from there to the Shiite minority, which is the largest minority in Lebanon. Lebanon is a country of minorities. There's no majority in Lebanon. There's just a whole lot of minorities, of which the Shia today are the largest. And they are proxies of Iran. So Iran's regional influence now stretches from Tehran to the Mediterranean, unheard of in the modern era. This is reminiscent of the Persian Empire of antiquity. So the region now is divided very much along these sectarian fault lines. Sunnah versus Shia, So where is Israel in all of this? What does it mean for Israel? First of all, Israel is no longer alone against the rest. That's how it used to be. Israel was by itself in the corner versus everybody else. But today, with Iran being the major threat as the Arabs see it, Israel is a potential ally. So countries like Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Oman, not to mention Egypt and Jordan that have peace treaties with Israel, are willing to cooperate with Israel. Not necessarily above board, but cooperation. Take even how we got here by air. Air India has a flight from Delhi to Tel Aviv that flies over Saudi Arabia. Now that could not be done before because the Saudis wouldn't allow flights to Israel over their territory. But now Air India flies to Israel over Saudi Arabia. It takes 6 hours to fly from Tel Aviv to Delhi. Before we had to go to some place in Europe or Turkey and take another flight from there to India. It was a big deal. This is a result of a much softer relationship between Saudi Arabia and Israel. And I would think in reference to what the ambassador said before about Indian relations with Saudi Arabia and with the United Arab Emirates being so important, it's much easier to balance those relations today with a very good relationship with Israel because these countries are not that hostile to Israel anymore. Largely, we could say that the Arab-Israeli conflict, which dominated the 20th century, is over. Israel has not fought a war against an Arab state for 46 years. The last war Israel fought with the Arab states was in 1973. Israel has fought in Lebanon against the Palestinians or against Hezbollah, against non-state actors. Fighting in Lebanon because of the weakness of the Lebanese state, not a war against Lebanon. But Israel hasn't fought the other Arab states at all. And Jordan and Egypt have made peace with Israel. A stable peace with Egypt, which has lasted for more than 40 years. And with Jordan, the peace has lasted for 25 years. Much longer than I think many people would have believed when these agreements were signed in the first place. But instead, there is the conflict with Iran. And Iran looms very large in the Israeli mind. A nuclear Iran for Israel is a nightmare. Israel is a very small territory. A nuclear attack on Israel could be absolutely devastating. So Israel, needless to say, is very concerned about this notion of a nuclear Iran. And people say, well, do you really think the Iranians would drop a nuclear bomb on Israel? The retaliation against Tehran, against Iran, would be unbelievably destructive, even if it was only by Israel itself. And it might be even done by other countries too. Why would the Iranians do that? Well, it's highly likely that the Iranians won't do that. Highly likely. But if Iran threatens to wipe Israel off the face of the earth, and if they have the nuclear capability to do so, maybe there's just 1% of a chance that they might do it. No Israeli prime minister would say, well, there's only a 1% chance, I'll ignore it. So Israel cannot ignore that possibility, even though it's not very likely. But that's not even the main problem here. The main problem is elsewhere. Israel has a variety of non-state actors, enemies on its borders, like Hezbollah and Hamas. And Hezbollah has now acquired an arsenal of, they say, 170,000 rockets and missiles trained on Israel. being steadily upgraded with the use of GPS, therefore to be far more precise. How can Israel retaliate effectively against Hezbollah if they attack Israel? If Iran has a nuclear umbrella over Hezbollah, they don't use it, it's just there. Will Israel have the freedom of maneuver to do what it thinks it should do? Or will it be constrained in its ability to make decisions on issues of war and peace in a threatening situation like that? Just as a comment in parenthesis, the fact that Hezbollah and other players in the region can bring this amount of rocketry to bear on Israel's population is a radical change of the situation as it was in the early years of Israel's creation. Israel's military doctrine was founded on a principle that the war cannot be fought in Israel's own territory. Israel is too small, too densely populated. If there is to be a war, it must be fought on the enemy's territory. The first thing that must take place is the transfer of the war to the enemy's territory. Rocketry and missiles allow the Arabs to defeat this Israeli purpose. They can bring the war to Israel's territory, and there's not that much that Israel can do about it. It's not like the old days, when the Arab air forces were not capable of attacking Israel because the Israeli air force was too good. Missiles is a different kind of problem. Israel has anti-missile systems, but they are not foolproof. So this is a serious issue, and Israel is, needless to say, extremely concerned. And I know, even from my discussions with Ambassador Raminder many years ago, I know Israel and India are not on the same page vis-a-vis Iran. We aren't, and we weren't in the past either. But what I think is true is that neither Israel nor India have ever allowed our difference on Iran to upset the relationship between us. We don't bring it up to hurt India, and India doesn't bring it up to hurt us. And I think that remains true. But I would say on the question of Iran, there is an element of Israeli policy that I think should change. I can understand Israel wielding the big stick against Iran, preventing the Iranians from settling in Syria in order to create a military presence in Syria, which they are trying to do now. And Israel trying by military means to prevent that, and quite successful for most of the time. The big stick is not enough. And I think that what is missing from Israeli policy vis-a-vis Iran is an attempt not to dispose of the big stick, but along with the use of force, a serious effort to use diplomacy as well. What can we achieve through diplomacy? Maybe starting with some second track or some intermediary, we can get somewhere. If we don't, and if a diplomatic effort fails, there's nothing to lose by it. We keep on coming back to Syria. Iran now is a country that has a border with Israel because they sit in Syria. How did they get there? Thanks to the Syrian civil war and the victory of the present regime in Syria, the Assad regime, which was and is friendly to Iran, because they themselves belong to a religious minority which is indirectly affiliated with Shia. Assad won very much thanks to the intervention of the Russians. And the Russian intervention is a dramatic affair in terms of how the Middle East is shaping up now in this 21st century. The role of the United States is receding. The US has less of an interest in the Middle East as they become independent of Middle Eastern oil. And the US footprint in the region is being gradually reduced. The Russians have taken advantage of that in order to relate to three fundamental Russian interests. Russia seeks to re-establish itself as a great power. The dismantling of the Soviet Union was a very demoralizing act for the Russian people. Very nationalistic, very patriotic. Want to see Russia up there again as a great power. Putin is furthering that ambition and endears himself to the Russian population through that ambitious foreign policy. And Russia's intervention in Syria was driven by this desire to project Russian power as a great player. As part of this, to be a great power in the Middle East, the Russians need bases. They have bases, air and naval, in Syria, and they want to preserve them. They want a regime in power in Syria that makes the preservation of Russian bases guaranteed. And the third, political Islam. The Russians have got their own problem of political Islam. Chechnya, the Chechens. The language that was second only to Arabic in ISIS was Russian. And that was the Chechnyan fighters in ISIS. The last thing the Russians wanted was to see these radical Islamists winning in Syria. And from there to threaten Russia. That has, as I say, its own internal Islamic problem. And Russia and Iran together have the upper hand in Syria today. The upper hand to the Arabs and posing a serious challenge to Israel. That doesn't mean that the Iranians can do all that they please. Israeli military action constrains them. The sanctions on Iran have a serious debilitating effect on what the Iranians can spend in Syria. And the Russians and the Iranians are not entirely on the same page in Syria. The Russians want stability. They want Assad to remain in power. They want Syria to be stable, to enable the Russians to sit there peacefully and do as they please. Iran has a destabilizing effect on Syria because of the challenge that it poses to Israel. And the Russians are not an enemy of Israel. You have to remember that there are 1 million Russians who live in Israel, Jews who emigrated from the former Soviet Union to Israel, who have an affinity with Russia, and Russia has an affinity with them. So the days of the Cold War are over. It's not Israel versus Russia or the Soviet Union, and Israel is very careful not to clash with the Russians in Syria. And the Russians leave Israel a certain measure of space to do what Israel has been doing against Iran there over the last few years. In all of this, what about the Palestinians? I've never mentioned them. And many in Israel would say, who cares about the Palestinians these days? The Arabs don't. The Arabs have other problems. Iran is much more of a problem for Saudi Arabia than the Palestinians. The Palestinian refugees from 1948. There are millions of Arab refugees from last year and the year before, which are much more of an international problem than the refugees of 1948, the great majority of whom have found a place. So, the Israeli government would say there's no need to move on the Palestinian issue. And this, the Trump initiative, the so-called deal of the century, I think is not the deal of the century, not the deal of the week, not a deal. It's not going to bring about much change. What is known of the Trump initiative has been flatly rejected by the Arabs, the Palestinians, and other Arabs who see in it as something quite insufficient. But I would argue that Israel cannot afford to ignore the Palestinian question, even if the international community doesn't really care. Israel has to relate to the Palestinian question. Israel has to find some kind of modus vivendi with the Palestinians for Israel's own sake, not for the sake of the international community, and not to do the bidding of the international community, but for Israel's own sake. Israel is an ideological project. Israel was created as the nation state of the Jewish people. And we have always sought to be the nation state of the Jewish people and a democratic, legitimate member of the family of nations. If we continue to occupy, if Israel continues to occupy millions of Palestinians in the West Bank, gradually upsetting the majority that the Jews still have, barely. If you take the entire area of the Gaza Strip, Israel, and the West Bank, where the populations are now more or less equal, 6.5 million each, more or less. If Israel does not roll down that occupation somehow, Israel will be neither Jewish nor democratic, nor a legitimate member of the family of nations. So for Israel's own sake, there has to be a change. And the problem here is that it's awfully difficult to arrive at a solution based on a negotiation with the Palestinians. The gaps between the Israelis and the Palestinians are simply too large. They are presently unbridgeable. And I would say in such a reality, it is incumbent upon Israel, the stronger player, to launch an initiative of its own. And over the next 10 years or so, to gradually roll back the occupation, irrespective of whether there is or isn't a negotiation with the Palestinians, so that we create a two-state reality, not necessarily a two-state solution. Solution is a big word, but a two-state reality, where there is a Palestinian state in the making, alongside Israel, in the hope that this will gradually lead to some kind of modus vivendi. And lastly, in conclusion, a word on this term, Middle East, that we keep on using and that I myself keep on using. And I must say, nothing to teach people in India about this term. You yourselves don't call the Middle East, but West Asia. The term Middle East is way out of date. It is a term that, in my mind, has lost its validity. It is an imperial creation. It was first used in 1902 and was intended to describe that area which is in the middle on the way to the Far East. Nobody in the Middle East can see the Middle East as the Middle East. In Tel Aviv or in Ankara or in Cairo, it's not the middle or the east of anything. It's only the Middle East if you're looking at it from London or from Washington. It's a term coined by outsiders and doesn't reflect the reality. What does Algeria have to do with the United Arab Emirates? The fact that they all speak Arabic is not of great importance. Nobody sees all of Latin America as one huge Spanish-speaking world. And it was the British who saw the Arabs as a nation, as one strategic unit that has to be protected as the passage to India. It's all about British imperialism. And it's a term, therefore, that has no analytical validity left in it. And I say the region should be seen as 4 subdivisions: North Africa, the Eastern Mediterranean, where Israel is, Israel, Egypt, Greece, Cyprus, and Turkey, if it was possible, but in terms of the relations at present, it's not. The Levant, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Jordan, and the Gulf. the Gulf states and Saudi Arabia. Those are four coherent regions. And Israel, rather than being part of the Arab world or the whole Middle East, which it is not, Israel really is part of the Eastern Mediterranean. Together with Egypt, which it has peace, has a lot in common with Greece and Cyprus, non-Arab, non-Muslim states, just like Israel. And if Turkey had good relations with Israel, it would be a welcome member of this bloc of Eastern Mediterranean countries. So I think it is time to dispense with the term Middle East and to think of the region in these four subdivisions, which I think are far more analytically valid. Thank you.
Wow. I'm glad no pins dropped. It would have been a lot of noise. Wonderful that was. The pin drop silence phrase got some meaning today. Thank you so much. What a scintillating lecture. Before I request Ambassador Bambawale for his concluding remarks and then vote of thanks by my friend, we'll take some questions. Couple of ground rules before the questions. Please do raise hands and ask questions. Do ask questions. Do send us a separate communication if you'd like to talk from PIC platform. We will organize that separately. But this one is a Q&A. Please do ask your question, and that's fine. Before we take the first question, Professor, it was great listening to you. And in the audience, we have members of Pune International Center. They include journalists, teachers, industrialists, professionals, friends from media, young and bright students. And PIC usually organizes all the programs and invites members as well as non-members, so that the public good created by this institution, thanks to the members who are here, is consumed by members as well as the non-members. So that's the audience for you, just to introduce before we start taking the questions. The first questions from Dr. Latika Padgaonkar, and then we'll come back to you. That's sure.
Thank you, Professor Sousa, for a very lucid and passionate lecture. The sentence that you uttered, which I caught on to towards the end, was moving towards a two-state reality, if not a two-state solution. That was the most hopeful thing that I heard, and I'm very happy that you have said so. While you're talking about Palestine, can you just inform us of what is happening in the Golan Heights? Because that is something that Mr. Netanyahu spoke about post-elections.
Well, these are two very separate things, solution and the Golan Heights. I think that there are many people, unfortunately, who these days say the two-state solution is dead and buried. It's not possible. I would argue that that is a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you argue that the two-state solution is dead and buried, it will be dead and buried. And I think we can arrive at this two-state reality. Things that have to be done, settlements would have to be removed in certain places. But these are things that are not impossible for Israel to do. And I would say much of the onus of doing things in this regard would be on Israel. But Israel would be very reluctant simply to walk out of the West Bank the same way it walked out of Gaza. Israel withdrew unilaterally from Gaza and peace did not follow. The rockets followed. Hamas had an option in Gaza, to turn Gaza into Singapore or to turn it into a rocket launcher against Israel. They chose the second. It's their choice, and an unfortunate choice. If the same would happen in the West Bank, life in Israel could become intolerable. The West Bank sits on top of Israel's coastal plain. The coastal plain, which is about 10 miles wide and 60 miles long, is very small, but that's where Israel is. That's where most of the population is, most of the industry, the high tech, the universities. That's Israel's heart and soul. So Israel has to be very cautious about this. And I would say we face a dilemma. Withdrawing from the West Bank is dangerous. Remaining in the West Bank is dangerous. So what do you do? And I would argue that we have to balance the one danger against the other, choose the lesser of all evil, and I would argue that the lesser of all evil is actually gradually withdrawing. And by gradually withdrawing, we do so in a way where we observe as we withdraw that the other side doesn't take negative advantage of this. And we will continue with further withdrawals. If the first part goes well, then there will be a second, a third, and a fourth. And I think that's the avenue we should pursue, whether the Palestinians agree or not. If they agree, that's fine. And if they don't, we'll withdraw anyway. I doubt very much whether the Palestinians would come and ask us to stay. So we can leave, whether it is in the framework of an agreement or not. On the Golan Heights, I must say, I think this is what Trump did is a gesture to Netanyahu, a gesture that had a lot to do with the Israeli elections. Netanyahu was running for re-election. Trump likes Netanyahu, so he did Trump a favor. He did Netanyahu a favor and recognized Israeli sovereignty over the Golan. I don't think that changes very much. Israel was not about to hand the Golan back to Syria, whether Trump recognized this or not. Syria is not a candidate for Israel to hand back the Golan in the foreseeable future. Syria today is such a political mess. I cannot see Israel withdrawing from the Golan, handing it over to a country like Syria, about which we have no idea in the next 10 or 12 years. Had Israel given the Golan back to Syria when it negotiated this in the 1990s and the negotiations failed, what would have come of the Israeli-Syrian border zone when the civil war broke out in Syria? The civil war in Syria would have been on Israel's doorstep. Not a very healthy situation. So I think there's not much enthusiasm in Israel on the left or the right. The international community doesn't pressure Israel on the Golan. There's no population problem there. There is a small Druze population, which is quite peaceful. And I think this situation will last for a long time between Israel and Syria, whether Trump does X, Y, or Z. So I don't think it's going to change very much.
While you're there, you could take that question and then we'll, yeah, please. And then we'll go towards the end. Yes.
Professor, thank you for a good talk. The genesis of the problem in Israel is with the Palestinians, who are Arabs and Sunni. So what is the genesis of the problem with Iran, between Israel and Iran? So that's something which I don't understand. Iran has no direct great love for the Palestinians or this thing. So what is the reason for this great enmity between these two nations?
Well, the Iranians and the Israelis are not natural enemies. Never gone to war with each other. And until the revolution in Iran in 1979, Israel and Iran were friends. Israel cooperated a great deal with Iran. But that is exactly the problem as far as the new regime in Iran is concerned. The Israelis were deeply involved in Iran, in agriculture, in industry, in construction, in helping the Iranian military. This is held against Israel today. You were cooperating with the United States in keeping the Shah in power, and he was the enemy of the enemy. And he was the cardinal enemy of the Iranian people that we had to eject. And Israel was the friend of the wrong side. And the Iranians are very suspicious of the United States and very suspicious of Israel. They fear that Israel and the US, or the US and Israel rather in that order, may seek the overthrow of this regime. They in turn threaten to wipe Israel off the face of the earth. Well, they also say death to America. The Americans can ignore. They're a little bit more powerful than Israel. They have 3,000 miles between the Pacific and the Atlantic and have neighbors like Canada and Mexico they can manage. We cannot manage a threat like that. And if the Iranians say, we intend to wipe you off the face of the earth, and we are going to build a nuclear capability to do so, well, we can't say we ignore this. But I did say in my talk, and I reiterate, as much as Iran is a very serious threat to Israel, I don't think we are doing enough to explore the diplomatic alternative. which may reduce the tension. Quite possible. India has very good relations with both sides. Quite possible. And maybe that is a very good idea. And I think that Israel should look for these kinds of opportunities along with brandishing the big stick. We cannot ignore the military need to do what we do. And I agree with what we are doing militarily. But I think that is in itself insufficient. There should be a diplomatic chapter as well. Well, a big carrot, I don't know what kind of big carrots we have to offer other than if through diplomacy, Israel would succeed in convincing the Iranians that we are not out to get them, and that neither is the United States out to get them, then I think we could make progress. But if the United States imposes sanctions on Iran, and some American senior officials say this is intended to overthrow the regime, well, that's not awfully helpful.
Thank you. We'll take a question at the far end, then I'll come back to the right. Yes, please. Thank you.
So one question is, there is a factor of declining resources within within Iran, the oil resources as well as the declining population of Iran. How does it factor into the Israeli assessment of Iran as a threat? And secondly, you mentioned about Israel being part of Eastern Mediterranean. So you think it is like moving towards European Union to become a part of European Union or something?
Iran is suffering economically from the sanctions. It's suffering economically also for domestic Iranian reasons that are not directly related to the sanctions. The population of Iran has doubled since the revolution, from 40 million to 80 million. And the people have not benefited from the revolution as much as they might have expected. But Iran seems to believe that whipping up hostility towards Israel is a way of maintaining popular support for the regime. And there has been no decline as a result of the sanctions and the weakening of the Iranian economy in the level of hostility projected towards Israel. On the contrary, even worse. So I don't think Israel can let its guard down, and I can only say again, Israel has to keep its guard up, but also to employ other means, such as diplomacy and thinking of ways of ameliorating the hostility between these two countries, because in the long run, we are not mortal enemies. And we're not in the past either. On the issue of the Eastern Mediterranean, this has to do with the Eastern Mediterranean. It has not to do with the European Union. Egypt is not a member of the European Union. Greece has a very problematic membership in the European Union. We have trade agreements with the European Union, but we are not a member of the European Union. And I don't think Israel would, in the long run, be fully accepted in the European Union. Turkey, which tried for very many years to be accepted in the European Union, was not. And a major reason why the Turks were not accepted in the European Union was because the European Union is a Christian club to which the Turks do not belong. Well, neither do we.
We'll take a question here and then I'll look around the others.
Yeah, my question is, as you mentioned, neither Russia, neither Turkey, neither Iran are in a position to rebuild Syria. But there was news that Syria has invited China into ports like Latakia and other ports, and China want to push their Silk Road to European territory. And even there was a port in Israel also, I think Haifa was given to China. So do you feel Chinese will have influence in that region in the near future?
Well, just let me correct you. Haifa was not given to China.
Yeah, but some agreement was signed.
No, China, there are Chinese contractors who are working in the rebuilding of a part of the port. That's true. Which the Americans, by the way, are very upset about. And Israel has allowed Chinese companies to compete for tenders in Israel and to build key elements of Israeli infrastructure. The underground railway system in Tel Aviv is being built by the Chinese also. The US is retreating from the Middle East as part of what they call the focus on Asia, which is actually to constrain China. But by withdrawing from the Middle East to constrain China, they may find China outflanking the United States and ending up in the Middle East. And that is something for the Americans to think about, something for the Israelis to think about also. But unquestionably, I think there is little doubt that China has aspirations in our region. They are long-term thinking people. They plan long terms ahead. I have met with Chinese delegations and diplomats in Israel. They are impressive in the homework they do. And you can see how they are thinking about the longer term. So I have no doubt that they are. And Israel has to be very careful about this because of the allies we have and because I think of our own concerns about China being too influential in the region.
Just one last question, because I'm looking at time and then I'm very keen to hear Ambassador Bambali's commentary. We'll go far end and take the question, and that will be the last one that we would take. I'm so sorry, that's the job that I got, I guess, After every session, I would have at least 3 or 4 of you who tell me, how they didn't get the opportunity. Apologies for that.
Good evening, Professor. I want to know how strong the Islamic State is and how much power it's going to wield in the coming decade.
I'm not sure I heard you. Did you say you want to know how strong the Islamic State is?
Yes.
I think we have to distinguish between the Islamic State as a territorial facet in the region, which I think has been demolished. The military power of ISIS was hugely exaggerated all along. ISIS did very well in the beginning because the enemies it fought never fought back. The Iraqis simply disintegrated before ISIS. When ISIS fought many enemies who fought back, ISIS was beaten by the Kurds, for example. So ISIS is not this formidable military power that people feared. But that is misleading. ISIS is internationally extremely dangerous. Not because of their military power, not because of their territorial base, which has disappeared, but because of ISIS as a source of inspiration for international terrorism. A source of inspiration and a source of support for international terrorism. This is very difficult to combat. And ISIS will engage in this to the best of its ability, which is quite impressive. So one shouldn't be confused by the military power of ISIS or by the lack of its territorial base, but rather by its capacity to engage in terrorism, for which you do not have to be very powerful. But you do have to have targets, intelligence, and supplies, and there are many who can do it. People who have fought for ISIS and have gone back to their home countries. France, for example, this could happen elsewhere. Sri Lanka, we have seen. This is extremely dangerous. Now, if I look at the Israeli example, we have fought terrorism fairly successfully. Not entirely successfully, but fairly successfully. And the reason for that is, I would say, twofold. We have an outstanding intelligence operation. Israel has developed over the years, because of necessity, an extremely good intelligence service. We have excellent intelligence on our enemies. Accompanied to the excellent intelligence is the capacity to use the intelligence with effective military force in time for this intelligence to be effective. We do that very well. The problem of those who stand up to ISIS is they have neither of these capabilities. If you take the Europeans, for example, their intelligence on ISIS is relatively poor. Their military capabilities are even poorer. And therefore, can they really have the wherewithal to deal with ISIS? And I'm not sure they do. You have the European Union. Each member of the European Union has its own intelligence organization. They don't cooperate. Or they cooperate, but they don't have a unified intelligence organization that unifies the so-called European Union. That makes the intelligence struggle versus enemies like ISIS very difficult. So there should be a great deal of international cooperation on intelligence, and that all countries that have an interest in combating ISIS should cooperate with all the intelligence they have. And these countries should build up a military capability to use the intelligence. If you do not have the military capability to use the intelligence you got from today to use against the enemy tomorrow, it's a waste of time. And these have to be created by the enemies of ISIS to wage an effective struggle against this terrorist element. Not ISIS as a military power, which it isn't, but as a force for terrorism internationally. It's a great problem.
Thank you so much, Professor. Thank you, Amresh. That concludes the Q&A session. And first, I'll be requesting Ambassador Bambawale to give his concluding remarks, and thereafter, Mr. Sujit Haridas, Executive Director of Ananta Center, who would propose vote of thanks. So, Ambassador Bambawale first. So,
Thank you so much, Prashant. Let me start by thanking Professor Asher Sasser for taking time out from his program and visiting us here in Pune. As you probably know, Professor, Pune and the western seaboard of India has a link with the Middle East, and I will continue calling it the Middle East till we change our terminology, which goes back centuries. Some of the early Persians who came by sea landed on the western coast of India, and we have some of their descendants in Pune even today. So we have an affinity with this part of the world, and your talk, I believe, has really gone down very, very well because of these linkages. In the modern times, Pune continues to have a link with Israel especially, on two fronts. One is, of course, on the technology front, and you met some of the technology companies earlier today. And secondly, on drip irrigation, which is something which we have managed to obtain in this part of India from Israel. Let me share with the audience, and let me first of all congratulate the audience for being such a wonderful audience. You've heard out Professor Sasser very, very patiently. Your questions were brilliant. But let me share with all of you two takeaways which I have while going through this experience. First of all, what struck me most was how an academic, who has always been an academic like Professor Sasser, is able to bridge the gap between academia on the one hand and the real world on the other. Since I am lecturing these days and teaching young scholars in Pune, it strikes me how in India we still live in silos. Academia is academia and the practical world is something totally different. I think there is a lot for us to learn from today's lecture in trying to bridge this gap between academics and theory on one hand and practice on the other. That is the first takeaway that I leave this evening with. The second is that the political vacuum that Professor Sasser spoke about, which is taking place in the Arab world, and he put that very, very succinctly, has led to the rise of radical Islam. And radical Islam is something that the whole world is tackling, is dealing with, coping with. Not only for us here in India, but also in Sri Lanka recently on Easter Sunday, we had an impact which was very, very vicious of radical Islam. And I think the world needs to get together to help the Islamic world and to help the Arab world in overcoming this political vacuum which is happening and which you described so well and so succinctly. The third point I'm going to make is that today's interaction was a cooperation between the Pune International Center and the Ananta Aspen Center in Delhi. And I believe that this is something which is here to stay. We look forward to having many more speakers coming from across the world to Pune. As you can see, Professor Sassar has had a bigger audience here at the Pune International Center than he had in Delhi. And it shows that there are people it shows that there are people who are interested not only in international issues, not only in international affairs, but also India's own domestic political affairs. And I think one of the objectives of the Pune International Center is to try to show Lutyens Delhi, and I'm talking to Sujit here, of course, because he represents Lutyens Delhi here. I don't no longer live in Lutyens Delhi, I live in Pune. One of the objectives that we are trying to achieve at the Pune International Center is to impress on Lutyens Delhi that there is thinking on national and international issues even outside Delhi in places like Pune. I've traveled to other places like Cochin and Calcutta. There is a lot of thinking happening there too. But I think it is very important that we continue to get speakers like Professor Sassar this evening to Pune in the future, and we will continue to work on that from the Pune International Center. I, of course, want to end with my own words of thanks to Professor Sassar for having come all the way to Pune. I hope it has been a rewarding experience for him, and I hope he can come again today. He can come again to Pune sometime in the future, even while I leave the formal thanks and vote of thanks to Sujit. Thank you very much for being such a lovely audience, and thank you for being with us here today. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Sassar, for this insightful session today here. And it was an amazing learning for us in the geopolitics and society in the Middle East or West Asia. Professor Sassar, you had a hectic schedule in Delhi, followed by in Pune, and it was terrific 3 days that we had with you, and we look forward to interacting with you. Ambassador Gautam Abbawale, thank you for chairing this session. Thank you for your association with Anand Aspen Center, and we look forward to working with you very closely. And our special thanks to Pune International Center for hosting us today for this program. And we are very happy to partner with you, and thank you, Prashant, for all the help. And we hope this association is going to continue in the coming years, and we do many, many programs here with Pune International Center. A special thanks to our partners, Tel Aviv University and CII. We have Gary Sussman here from Tel Aviv University. I think he has just stepped out. And our special thanks to him for helping us to do these programs. And for those who are not aware of Anand Aspen Center, we are at TREST. We are an institution based in Delhi. We focus on 3 areas of work. One is on international relations and foreign policy. Second is on policy dialogue, looking at national dialogues. And the third is value-based leadership development. And once again, thank you all for coming and joining us for this session here today. Thank you.